Hello and welcome to the Institute of Economic Affairs podcast. I'm Callum Price. Today I'm joined by Kristian Niemietz, our Editorial Director. Kristian has just written a piece for our SubStack, insider.iea.org.uk, called In Defence of Unfair Competition. Kristian, unfair competition sounds like a bad thing. Walk me through your argument.
Yes, so the idea is simply, I've been thinking for a while that we often treat market competition as somehow equivalent to a sports competition. And superficially, I guess that helps us because, sports competition, that's something we're all familiar with. And it's an area where everybody accepts the need for, or the case for competition. And therefore, it's a relatively easy argument to make that you can tell people, look, you like competition in the Olympic Games and in football and wherever else. So why shouldn't we organize the economy also in that way, have competition in the provision of goods and services? And then it no longer sounds so alien. But I have a couple of problems with that comparison because market competition is actually not very much like a sports competition. So first of all, there's the issue that in a sports competition, you have the different participants all doing the same thing, and they know in advance what they're going to do. So in a 100-meter sprint, they all, the moment the guy shoots the starting pistol, fires the pistol, they all run into the same direction. Whereas actual competition in a market is more about, before the competition starts, we don't know what the different participants are going to do. It's more about finding out different and comparing different ways of trying to achieve the same aim and working out which of those are going to work. And in that regard, market competition is very much not like a sports competition. So for that reason, I'm not that happy about the analogy. But there's also the issue that that sometimes you get people calling for interventions in a market on the grounds that they would say that some market outcome is unfair. Somebody has an unfair advantage. And that's an argument which makes perfect sense in a sports competition. That's why we had all these controversies about biologically male transgender athletes competing in the women's league and, say, swimming, because there, we want fairness. We don't want any participant to have an obvious advantage. And in sports where physical strength matters, being biologically male clearly is an advantage, and therefore that violates our sense of fair play, and it also ruins the spectator sport experience because it makes it easier to predict who is going to win. And the whole point is we don't want to know in advance who is going to win, because that's otherwise the whole suspense goes away. But market competition isn't really like that, because in a market competition, it's not that we want to watch the different competitors somehow with their competing with their different strategies. That process, that's not something that's in itself observable or that's something that we would enjoy watching. We just want to work out who is in the best position to do a particular job, to deliver a particular consumer good. And that often happens, whoever is best placed should do it. And whether they are best placed for reasons that are completely under their control, or whether that is for reasons that they have just somehow through as a matter of luck or accident that somehow has just been given to them, that's actually irrelevant. So if you look at, I use the example of wine production, where you could say it's really not fair if an English wine grower has to compete with a Spanish one, because the Spanish wine grower obviously has a massive advantage, which is many more hours of sunshine per year. And it's not the fault of the English wine grower that they have to cope with the climate that we have here, that they don't have all these extra hours of sunshine. You could say it's an unfair advantage if you wanted to apply the logic of a sports competition. I would just say, well, if the Spanish wine grower has that advantage, that means they are the ones who should produce the wine. They should grow the wine. And if that just can't be done here on a big scale, then it shouldn't be done here on a big scale. You could, in principle, set up a vineyard in Iceland if you wanted to. So you would probably need a massive glass house, and you would have colossally high energy consumption. But it is in principle, it would be possible to set up a glass house in Iceland and grow wine. And if you then said, but it's unfair that the Spanish and the Italian wine growers are undercutting me because they have all this extra sunshine, and therefore I need tariff protection, that would be a nonsensical argument, because even though it would be true, it would not be your fault that Iceland has a much colder climate than the Mediterranean, but that doesn't mean that you somehow deserve protection. What it means is simply you shouldn't grow wine on Iceland because it can't be done sensibly.
So the analogy is absolutely spot on, isn't it? Because you see the recent sort of escalating trade war driven largely by Donald Trump is using lots of these words. Indeed, yesterday he tweeted using the phrase, we're gonna get rid of unlevel playing field. So he's literally using the sporting analogy. But you highlight how that is absurd when you talk about things like geography or those sorts of lucky advantages that countries may have, and maybe we should focus on the places where we have advantages, like, I don't know, fishing, for example, because we're an island, to make it extremely simple. But isn't it slightly different for if a country is giving their companies an advantage over our companies, say, to use that language, by subsidizing or by giving them tax breaks or state aid or anything like that maybe our companies don't benefit from?
Well, I mean, if I was advising a foreign government, I would advise them not to do it, not to try to give special favors to their exporters. It's just that if you take policies that happen elsewhere as something external, something given that you cannot influence, I would say we should not try to respond to it by leveling the playing field. Because, say, from the perspective of a consumer, you go into a supermarket and you see in some areas the foreign product is cheaper than the domestically produced one, or in some cases there might not even be a domestically produced one because producers elsewhere have various advantages. You're not going to know why that is unless you do the market research. You're not going to know to what extent that differences in cost is attributable to differences in maybe labor costs, to what extent it is about geography, and to what extent it is maybe to do with government policy. You just see the final outcome. You just see, okay, the imported product, £5, the domestic product, £7. That's all you see. And I'd say, well, let's just take that as given and respond to it. Of course, it's not an earned advantage if an exporter can really benefit from government policies. Whether that's, say, in the case of China, the accusation is that it's because they play around with the exchange rate, whatever it is. In most cases, it's disputed whether it is actually true that foreign governments are promoting exporters, but Trump claims it, and that's it's up for debate. But I'd say even if we had an unambiguous case, even if we had a case where it is clearly true that a foreign government is subsidizing their exports, yes, you could say, well, it's undeserved, the cost advantage that gives that exporting company, but it's no more undeserved than a difference in geography or climate or anything else, and therefore I would just treat that as just another difference. And we should not try to level the playing field. We should just buy stuff from whoever is best placed to do that, whether they are best placed because of geographic and climatic factors, or because of, say, an industry cluster, or, say, some industry just being historically overrepresented in a particular area, or whether that is because of specific government policy choices. that just shouldn't concern us. We should not even ask the question where the cost difference comes from. We should simply observe who is able to produce a good in the best possible way, meaning in the eye of the consumer, the best ratio of price to quality. And then we should, as consumers, make our choices, and the government should just stay out of that process.
Yes, so the point is, I guess, that we were trying to level the playing field in these situations between the £5 item and the £7 item. We shouldn't be doing that, because that doesn't mean bringing the £7 item down. It means bringing the £5 item up. So we're effectively harming ourselves if we take the Trumpian approach, if you like.
Yes, so that will be the next step. What then happens is that you've made consumers poorer, and they will then have to cut back somewhere else. So you're not even benefiting your economy in overall terms. So if you make imports more expensive, then consumers will either have to pay more for those imports, or they have to switch to a more expensive domestic alternative. But whichever it is, either way, the consumer is poorer, and the poorer consumer will have to cut back expenditure on something else. And that means some other part of your economy is going to shrink or not grow as fast as it otherwise would have. So you're not making yourself richer in overall terms by pursuing this notion of fairness anyway.
So just to go back to the sports analogy then, you have a great line in your piece about there not being Team USA fans cheering shipping containers as they leave the port in New York. But there is an element of domestic pride, if you like, in production. So people, campaigns to buy British, and in supermarkets, and companies will quite proudly put Union Jacks or flags on their produce to say it's been made locally. And there's a need. People feel like there's maybe a need, or certainly an appeal, to buying things that have been produced at home. So is there not some truth to that side of the argument? And B, is that not rooted in something that we think we might need, which is, some domestic supply of essential goods?
Well, it's certainly true that you get companies that try to tap into a sentiment of patriotism by putting a flag on their product, even if it is not directly related to features of the product, even if you don't, strictly speaking, need to know where it was made. But then consumer tastes are entirely subjective. So if you value the fact that a product was made in Britain or in America, then from your perspective, that is a feature of the product. And if that makes the consumption of that product more enjoyable to you, then that is part of the overall package. So when we say this product is better than another, okay, I guess there are objective performance metrics. In the case of a car, you can look at engineering data, and that's just objective, and that there's no argument here. But if, say, an American-made car is, from purely an engineering perspective, not as good as the Japanese or whatever competitor, but the consumer still enjoys it more because they value that sentiment of buying American, and it makes them feel good, then from that consumer's perspective, the fact that the product is American is very much part of what the product is. And in that sense, that's absolutely fine if that influences their consumer choices. It's just in that case, that consumer values that feature in itself.
Then what about the domestic supply point then? We don't just want to protect our industries because of a sort of blind loyalty to products that have been made here, but actually we want to make sure that we still have the capacity to build. Steel is the obvious one that people talk about a lot, but also create food, which is the argument that farmers rely on quite a lot for sometimes protectionist arguments. What about that? Is hypothetically Chinese government-backed steel undercutting our steel industry, not harming our general security as a nation as a whole?
Well, I say security in trade simply means you don't want to put all your eggs into one basket. You want to secure goods from a variety of places, rather than having them all in one place, whether that's in manufacturing or in agriculture or whatever else. There might be some local shock that harms domestic production. So you need the capacity to source stuff from a variety of places. And that gives you greater security than just having a domestic industry. Because there's also the fact that, say, just because a producer of something is located within the border and has, say, the same passport as you, the same nationality as you, that doesn't mean that you have common interests. You still want that producer to be under competitive pressure from elsewhere, because otherwise, if they can rip you off, if they are in a position to do it, they will do it. They're not going to say, okay, but we're all part of the same national community, and therefore I will behave in a communitarian way. No, they will not. The domestic producer is in that sense not different from the foreign producer in that they don't care about your well-being per se. They will act as if they cared about your well-being because they know that you also have other options.
So competitive pressure then competitive pressure and diversification, the best way to security and overall wealth increases than protectionism, yep. We might say. It might be a nice place to end on. Although one last question, I guess. So Trump and the protectionists have the national pride and the level playing field and the sports fallacy to lean on. And if we're making the arguments against them, what do we lean on? Because maybe saying unfair competition is good actually might not be necessarily the best way of going about it. But what should we be as classical liberals sticking our flag on the ground and shouting about? Cheaper prices, more efficient economies, all those things?
Yes, all of it. And I think we should just look at cases where trade policy has shifted rapidly, and you get the success stories of free trading economies like Hong Kong and Singapore, where they, I guess, never really had the option of being protectionist because they were so small. But whether it was by choice or necessity, they did adopt free trading policies, and it worked fantastically for them. Whereas on the other end of the spectrum, you had Latin America for most of the 20th century, where they went for this strategy called import substitution, thinking that if they just put up sky-high tariff barriers and develop their own industries, that is going to develop their economies. It clearly hasn't worked. What it meant was that you had a few a few large companies that were protected from competition and could get away with inefficient production and charging high prices, but you ended up with low productivity, high prices, concentrated markets, and everything that we don't want, and that is a direct result of protectionism. So in practice, if we look at real-world experiences of free trading economies, protectionist economies, you get a pattern where it is generally quite clear that the more free trade-minded places are doing better economically. And even the examples that seem to contradict that, upon closer inspection, don't really. So Donald Trump likes to talk about American trade policy in the late 19th century, when the US was a protectionist economy compared to Europe, at least. So their average external tariff was much higher than, say, Britain's or other European economies. So yes, they were protectionist at the time, and they did grow fast at the same time, but the protection wasn't the reason why they grew fast. Our colleague Daniel Freeman has written about this, where economists who have looked at this on a more disaggregated basis, industry by industry, sector by sector, where they do find is actually the less protected industries that do better. And more generally, say, even if you didn't have those numbers, even if we didn't have those studies, I think it's just pretty clear that America, being such a large economy, they are less reliant on trade than, say, Hong Kong, Singapore, or Switzerland, or New Zealand. And therefore, they just have this large internal market For that reason alone, they can get away with a measure of protectionism, but that still doesn't mean it's a good idea. Just because you can get away with it, just because it doesn't damage you as much as it might damage somebody else, that doesn't mean that you should do it.
So the argument then for free trade and free markets, as ever, is follow the evidence.
Yes.
And on that note, thank you for joining us again on the IEA podcast. If you'd like to read Kristian's full piece, go to our Substack at insider.iea.org.uk. And until next time, thanks very much.